How many calories do weightlifters need? What's the best macro split for heavy lifting and recovery? And which supplements are actually worth your money? Today's episode of the podcast is a live workshop that Professor Patrick Harty was kind enough to lead for our weightlifting team. And if you want access to all of the workshops that our team members get, then check out a free week of the OlyStrong or Competition Strong weightlifting team. All right, let's get into the episode.
All righty. Well, hello, everyone. So my name is Patrick Harty. I'm a professor at Lindenwood University, so where Calvin is located, and really excited to just chat with you all today about some nutrition. So a little bit about me briefly in terms of background before we get into it. So I was an Olympic weightlifter back in the day, so competed on Lindenwood's team, now retired, not quite just kind of up to the challenges of it anymore. It's definitely a tough sport for me. So kind of at this point, though, what I enjoy doing is a lot of research support for Lindenwood weightlifting, done a variety of things related to sport nutrition, body composition, performance testing, force plate testing, all kinds of different angles. And I also teach at Lindenwood. So I teach sport nutrition, I teach biomechanics, I teach physiology, exercise physiology. So what I wanted to do today when Calvin asked me to present and chat with you all really was just kind of hit basic sport nutrition. So it sounded like at least there was a potential for high school athletes to be interested or potentially come. And so we're going to talk very, very just kind of straightforward, initial level sport nutrition knowledge, but with a specific focus on weightlifting. So we're not going to be talking about endurance sports. We're not going to be talking about, kind of just general population, but what's kind of required for weightlifting. And then we'll also talk a little bit about supplements. And then kind of towards the end of the presentation, if you all have any questions, we can definitely chat and nerd out, about some research. All right, so before we get into kind of the specifics, we need to kind of think about an approach to sport nutrition. And nutrition, as we kind of just conceptualize it, and those of you who are in the audience or watching this who have had my sport nutrition class, some of these slides, or pretty much all of these slides, are used at different points throughout the semester. So college level sport nutrition content, but we're just kind of distilling it down to one hour, so to speak. But we got to think about nutrition in terms of not just digestion, not just ingestion, but also kind of the sum of all these processes. So I'm going to switch to a laser pointer so I can kind of point to the screen if we need to. But we're thinking about what we eat, so what we choose, what we put in our body, how we digest it. So is that effective? Is it working properly? Do we have some sort of kind of illness or kind of issue or condition that's impairing digestion? Are we absorbing the food and then ultimately metabolizing it? And so from that, right, then we're able to kind of think through what we're putting in our body to fuel ourselves. Now, big picture, right, we need to make sure that we're on the same page about nutrients when we're thinking about sport nutrition. So nutrients, just referring to things that we consume. And we've got kind of two major categories of nutrients, macronutrients versus micronutrients. Once again, I do apologize for those who've already, talked or are aware about basic nutrition, but some people aren't. So let's just make sure we're kind of at that baseline. So macronutrients, these are going to be things that we access energy from, right? So these are large molecules, so proteins, carbohydrates, or fats, and we can break them down and release the chemical bonds or break the chemical bonds that are holding these molecules together to release energy that our body can use. Whereas micronutrients, right, these guys down here, these are things that we still need to consume, but in much smaller amounts, so usually less than a gram per day. So we're seeing, certain vitamins that are going to be important for bodily function, certain minerals, electrolytes, et cetera. And then water is kind of its own little unique special case in that we don't get energy from it, but we do need a lot of it, right? So we're going to be consuming it in much larger than gram amounts, and it doesn't give us energy, but it's crucial. So we'll talk briefly about hydration. And so sport nutrition, right? Some of the goals here, right? We're not just thinking about kind of feeding the body and optimizing for health. We want to think about energy, right? So are we getting enough energy to sustain our activity? Are we repairing and recovering properly? So obviously when we think recovery, at least I would hope that most people's kind of minds go towards protein. So protein consumption, protein intake, and then obviously all the recovery modalities that are, most efficacious, such as sleep, proper periodization training, so obviously great coaching from Calvin and Brian. That's all going to be important for recovery. And then kind of thinking on the dietary side, right, what are some reasonable and practical strategies that are actually going to help us achieve those goals? And so this, I think, is kind of the framework that I want us to work off of if, for instance, you haven't really thought about nutrition a whole lot for yourselves, or you haven't dialed it in, right? We need to figure out our basic nutrition needs, and we're going to dial it in starting with energy. So how much food do we need to consume to meet our goals? Are we trying to gain weight? Or are we trying to lose weight? Then we're going to figure out of those three macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, and fats, we're going to figure out the amounts of each of those that we should be eating, because each of those is going to be giving us energy in the form of kcals. We want to make sure that we're optimizing the ratios of those macronutrients. So first we do protein, then we do carbs, then we do fats. Other types of athletes that are not Olympic weightlifters, maybe we have a different kind of approach. Endurance athletes, maybe carbs are first. But for weightlifting, protein for sure is going to be most important. And then everything else can kind of fall into place. So let's briefly talk about energy. The total amount of food, right? The total amount of energy or kcals that we're going to be consuming across the day is dictated by a couple different factors. Some of it has to do with body size, sex, age, activity status, muscle mass, all kinds of different kind of parameters. But ultimately, what we're able to figure out is of the calories we eat across the entire day, what are they being used for? And so a large portion of them are going to be used just to keep us alive. So resting energy expenditure, meaning the proportion of the food we eat that just basically is used for metabolic processes throughout the body. Released as heat, keeps our cells active and moving and alive and doing our thing. And so usually about 60 to 75% of the energy of the calories we're consuming are going to be just used to keep the lights on, so to speak. We then have a certain amount of the energy that we're going to be consuming, which is called the thermic effect of feeding or food or eating, TEF, TEE. There's a couple different varieties of acronyms and abbreviations for it. It requires a certain amount of calories to absorb and digest the food that we consume. And so it's usually right around 10% of our total kind of caloric intake for the day is going to be used just to process that food. So it's a good trade-off. Obviously, we have to burn energy, but we're going to be getting way more, right? We're getting kind of an abundance of kcals or just of that energy in our body. The other component of the food that we're eating, where it goes, that's a lot more variable, is going to be physical activity energy expenditure. So this is the energy that we're going to be using to contract our muscles, doing stuff. In this case, right, weightlifting. And so depending on how much activity we're doing, this is variable. So this could be 5% on a day where you just lay around and sit in your couch all day. Or it could be 30%. Let's say if you're doing a 2-a-day session, you've got, squats and pulls in the morning, and you've got a bunch of Olympic lifts in the evening, and you did a bunch of walking throughout the day to different classes or, on your job or whatever it is. Or, in the case of extreme kind of physical activity, let's say that we're dealing with not weightlifting, but like a marathoner or an ultra endurance athlete, that can get up to like 60 or 70% in terms of their kind of total energy intake going towards physical activity. The absolute numbers are not going to be any lower here. It's just that we're doing so much physical activity that it's going to be a much larger piece of the pie. So being aware of those places that our calories go is crucial. So we're going to use some to keep the lights on. For most of us, including I'd say most weightlifters, it's going to be right around 60, 70%, right around 30-ish% tops for most weightlifters going towards activity, and then a certain amount going towards digestion. And so to kind of first figure out where we're at, right, we need to figure out how much food we need to eat. And so, if I were in person in a class, I'd be asking everyone, okay, so what do we think is typically the kind of common or standard amount of calories that someone should be eating across the day? Like, what do we see just on the nutrition labels? And someone would say 2,000 kcals, right? 2,000 kilocalories. That's not a one size fits all number. Some people who are larger are going to need more to maintain their body mass. Some people who are smaller may only need 1,200 calories or 1,500 calories. So we need to kind of get an estimate of those energy needs. And so a couple options, we can use equations. So there's a variety of different lab kind of equations that are based on data collected in labs, where we can put in someone's body weight, age, sex, etc., and ultimately get their calories. Or we can measure it using devices called metabolic carts. We have a variety of them at Lindenwood. I think I want to say 4. Very expensive, very, very finicky pieces of equipment, but they measure the gases that you're breathing in and out, right? So carbon dioxide and oxygen, there's a known relationship between the amount of those gases and the energy we're burning. And so we can kind of more directly measure your calories. Apps like MyFitnessPal, other kind of diet tracking apps, or maybe a custom kind of template that, let's say, coaching staff may use, they're going to typically be using some sort of equation or formula where you put in that person's or your specific information and we get an estimate of calories. And so a common kind of caloric needs estimation equation would be the Harris-Benedict equation. There's a variety of other ones, but we can see that we're multiplying body mass, height, and age. And then also there's two different equations, one for males, one for females. So sex is a parameter as well. So we estimate our resting energy expenditure. And if we go back for a second, that is this portion of our total energy needs, right? So resting energy expenditure, the amount of energy that we would be using if we didn't move at all, if you just laid on the couch all day. So I know there's a couch behind me. You may be able to see that. But if I just laid over there all day, I'd probably still need about 1,800 to 2,200 calories to maintain my current body mass because I'm putting out heat. My cells are active, they're alive, they're using ATP, etc. What we need to do to figure out our total caloric intake, though, because we're not just laying on a couch most days, hopefully, is we're going to try to get a sense of how active someone is. And we can multiply that resting energy expenditure by what's called an activity factor. It's a multiplier. And so someone who's relatively sedentary may only need a multiplier of 1.2. Someone who's extremely active, especially like an endurance athlete or a ultra marathoner or something, probably needs an activity factor closer to 1.9, 2.2, somewhere in that neighborhood. For, I'd say, the majority of weightlifters, you're probably somewhere in there, lightly to moderately active in terms of activity factors. You might be thinking to yourself, if you're watching this now or you're watching this when it's recorded, like, hey, wait, I'm not lightly active. Yeah, but weightlifting is, you're only like moving for really a very, very short period of time. There's a lot of sitting around. There's a lot of chatting with teammates or other people at the gym. And so it's maybe just not quite as involved in terms of total energy expenditure as other disciplines. Where, for instance, let's say someone's running, they're consistently moving the whole time. With weightlifting, just due to the nature of the sport, with its very, very high, strength and power demand, phosphagen energy system demand, we're going to be seeing really somewhere in the neighborhood here. So you figure out your baseline calories, you use one of those equations or you use an app, you figure out your activity factor. So a lot of the apps will ask you how active you are. They're doing this. They're basically trying to figure out what to multiply by. We then get an idea of your kind of baseline or just standard energy intake. And then we can either add or subtract calories to try to gain or lose weight. If you're, for instance, trying to bulk up, add 500 calories. If you're trying to slim down a little bit, maybe we subtract 300 to 500 calories. So there's a little bit of gray area and a little bit of kind of trial and error here. Another way that we can kind of figure out whether we're at least guessing or calculating about where we should in terms of our caloric intake is looking at body weight change. So if someone, for instance, calculates out like, oh, I need 2,800 calories based on a resting metabolic rate of whatever and an activity factor of 1.8. It's a pretty high activity factor. And then they start gaining weight. That means they're eating too much. Or let's say we're losing weight, right? Let's say we calculate things out and we're trying to kind of slim down slowly. And I set my caloric intake at 2,100, figure out my kind of maintenance level. And then I subtract a little bit of calorie intake. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, I'm losing weight. Good. This is what I want to be doing. So if we're maintaining weight, we're kind of meeting our energy needs right where they are. If we're gaining weight, we're going to be having a caloric surplus. And then if we're losing weight, we're going to have a caloric deficit. So energy needs are going to be the first step in the equation. Really, really crucial for us to kind of get these right. And if we don't, it can really mess with our training adaptations. Very, very important that especially younger athletes are properly fueling themselves, getting enough protein, obviously, but mainly just getting enough food. There are certain sports, including weightlifting, right? Weight class sports, aesthetic sports, obviously. So, ballet, dance, gymnastics, cheer, but weight class sports are kind of part of that are at a higher risk of a syndrome called REDS, or relative energy deficiency in sport. And basically, if we're consistently under eating, it can really start to mess with our performance and health. So crucial that we get this right. So just kind of keep that in mind when we're kind of moving forward. Now, in terms of the macronutrients, so if we kind of think back, right? First, we figure out energy, then we figure out protein intake. So proteins, just to make sure we're kind of all on the same page here, this is going to be one of our macronutrients. It does give us energy, so 4 kcals per gram. So that means for every gram of protein, it contains 4 kilocalories of energy. But we don't really want to use this for energy.
Tired of programming that doesn't work? Inconsistent technique, missing lifts, or going months without PRs is all signs that your program isn't working. If this is you, I'd like you to consider joining the OlyStrong team, my online weightlifting program available in 3, 4, and 5 days a week for weightlifters looking to dial in their technique, get strong, and most importantly, set PRs. Each week is structured to support the things all weightlifters need. Enough practice in the snatch and clean and jerk to dial in your technique, a consistent strength program to build big squats, pulls, and presses, and accessory work carefully chosen to build muscle that supports your Olympic lifts. The program uses logical progressions that focus on building momentum each week instead of just maxing out every week, or worse, only lifting light to work on your technique. If this sounds like something you need, then scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below for a free week trial today. All right, back to the show.
Instead, what proteins are going to be used for is building tissues. They can be linked together, all these little subunits of proteins called amino acids, linked together end to end, and we form this big long chain of amino acid molecules that then folds up into a 3D shape. And that 3D shape is then going to do something. So maybe it's an enzyme, maybe it's a muscle protein, which contracts and it allows me to move my muscles. And so this particular macronutrient is going to be so important for weightlifting, crucial for recovery, crucial for health, crucial for strength, performance, etc. Where we get it, obviously, as I'm sure every weightlifter knows, meats, dairy products, obviously protein powder. So that's another option here. Plant proteins are a great source as well. We do have to be careful because plant proteins will not contain all 9 essential amino acids. So just to kind of make sure we're on the same page about that. Essential amino acids versus non-essential. So we have all these different subunits of proteins, but we got to get these 9 across the day, ideally within the same meal. Depending on disease status or pregnancy, sometimes we have even more amino acids, which are essential. These ones are non-essential. So that means we don't have to consume them because we can actually convert between these other ones. The liver is really good at that. So best case scenario is we basically get all 9 of these every single meal. Essential amino acids are going to be found in any sort of protein food, and a complete protein, right, something that has all 9 essential amino acids, is the best choice. What proteins are complete? Animal proteins. So we're seeing, for instance, your meat, your eggs, your dairy, your fish, etc. Soy protein is also going to be complete. That can be another great option. In terms of incomplete proteins, right? So we're dealing with, legumes, beans/legumes, lentils, peanuts, rice, various grains. We got to combine them and be a little bit more creative. Those proteins are not going to be as bioavailable, so we don't absorb as much. So it is really important that we're really careful about protein intake in the case of vegetarianism or veganism. And so for weightlifters, what we really need to be thinking about is a pretty high protein intake. This is our range for athletes, 1.4 to 2.2 grams per kilo. I used kilos here and just kept it as kilos because that is really standard in the scientific literature. And since we're all weightlifters here, guess what? We can think about it in kilos, right? We all know our body weight in kilos compared to, let's say, just an average person in America. So multiply that body weight in kilos times 1.4 or 1.6 or 1.8 or 2, whatever that number is. And somewhere in that range is where we probably should be shooting for protein intake. Probably for weightlifting, I would say 1.65 to 1.7 is the bare minimum in my mind. There's evidence to show that that really is kind of where we want to see, I'd say, this threshold to optimize strength and kind of muscle growth. You can go above 2.2 if you really want. It just gets expensive, and we're dealing with calories here, so we do need to kind of keep that in mind. But probably on the higher end of this range is going to be crucial for us. Emphasizing that whole protein source. So not, especially in the case of someone who is vegan or vegetarian, not just taking one source of protein where it's like, oh, I just had a bunch of red beans. That's it. And that was all I had for lunch that contained protein. And then I had, whatever. We got to combine multiple different protein sources. But even better is to try to get single whole protein sources. So in the case of a vegan or vegetarian, soy protein, other supplemental sources can be really helpful. In the case of an omnivorous athlete, obviously meats, dairy, protein powder, whey protein, etc. Awesome. In terms of kind of timing of protein intake, generally it seems that we want to spread it across the day. So have kind of individual protein meals. 3 to 6 is probably where we're looking. And kind of minimum amount of protein per meal is going to be in the neighborhood of about 24 grams, 25-ish. Maybe a little bit higher would be better. So like shooting for at least 30 grams of protein every single meal is probably going to be the way to go. Can you go above 30 grams of protein per meal? Yes, it will be used. The upper threshold is much higher than 30. Now, in terms of supplements, protein supplements are super helpful. Pardon me, but not required. So, those of you who are maybe watching this down the line, protein supplements are really, really great. They're convenient. They're actually very, very cheap in terms of the actual cost per gram of protein you're getting. And they're often very, very high quality. So whey protein, super bioavailable, really, really high protein quality, which is awesome. But you don't have to take it, right? If you have, let's say, concerns about supplements, or maybe, as a younger athlete, you have parents that, they're like, oh no, just eat foods. That's fine too. As long as you're hitting your protein intake goal and you're especially emphasizing those whole protein sources, then you'll be good to go. So I guess, is there any questions just while we're kind of pausing here? I'd be happy to kind of chat while we're, so either related to our total energy intake or our protein. Does anyone have any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, one question you mentioned that, the upper limit on the protein per meal is a lot higher. What is that upper limit?
Yeah, that's a good question, Brian. I think there's some evidence, and I'd have to look a little closer at that. But I mean, potentially like 80 to 100 grams. Like there's some really, yeah, I could follow up and find the specific study I'm thinking of. I don't want to go out on a limb, but it's much higher than 30. Where yeah, some people are like, oh, it's all wasted or it turns to fat, and it's like depending on kind of the just the anabolic environment in the body, so to speak. Like if we're really depleted in terms of our amino acid pool, I mean, we can definitely take in more, and especially post exercise, like that is when the body is best primed to uptake amino acids. So yeah, I can follow up and find that specific article because I did a bunch of just kind of different tracing work. So essentially like labeling protein with like a mild isotope and then tracking it throughout the body and seeing how much is used. So it's really fascinating stuff. But yeah, I don't want to say a specific number off the top of my head, but it's much higher than 30. More than
Interesting. And then you also mentioned that like about 24 to 30 is like the minimum that you want to have per meal. I think that I've heard Calvin talk about this before, but what is the like why is it that there's kind of that minimum threshold that you want to have per meal outside of just hitting the total overall?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, protein's always going to be good, right? If you, let's say, have a meal with zero protein versus a meal with 10 grams of protein, in terms of the context of weightlifting, I would take the 10-gram protein meal anytime. But there is basically this concept within sport nutrition called the leucine threshold. So, meaning that to kind of optimize the signaling, right? The anabolic environment to tell our muscles to start building and getting repaired and recovered after training, especially. It's kind of, I guess, what's the word, topping out at a certain amount of leucine, which is one of those amino acids. And so generally someone's going to need in the neighborhood of like 2 to 3 grams of leucine, 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine from a specific protein meal to get that kind of maximal signaling. And we get about that much leucine from roughly 25 to 30 grams of protein. And so older adults or older athletes, so let's say someone's 65 years old and, a master's competitor, they need to eat even more protein than a young person or younger person, I should say, just because they're less sensitive to leucine. So shooting for a little bit more protein than let's say like, oh yeah, I had 15 grams. It's like, that's not bad, but it's not optimizing. So kind of always thinking like good, better, best, at least trying to go for the best is the way to go. And especially post-workout, like really making sure that first protein feeding post-workout, that one's going to be important.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question too. My question was about REDs, like the relative energy deficiency in sport. And do you think it's like, is it possible to like have REDs or be under eating, but still see your weight at the same number, like not be losing weight?
Yeah, I think so, especially if someone's already down at a very, very low body weight to begin with, and then they're just super, super kind of restrictive, then yeah, you're kind of perpetuating reds at that point. I mean, if someone's like walking around and they clearly have, let's say some excess fat stores and they're in a caloric deficit, they're like, oh, I'm going to get reds. It's like, probably not. That's not the context. But yeah, if someone's really lean already or they've been restricted and then they just keep dipping, and especially in our female athletes, if they lose the menstrual cycle, they're amenorrheic now, like that's going to be kind of a key, like, just point. There's a really interesting paper, and I saw at least that Jordan Dearth was on the call, that I remember showing her because she was doing a presentation on Reds for sport nutrition when she took it with me. And it's basically like all these individuals who had Reds, primarily endurance athletes, but they had basically gone through the disease and shared some of their different just experiences with it and different quotes about it. It was kind of more of like this qualitative research, just explaining kind of what it felt like. But yeah, it was really interesting, just kind of feelings like surrounding food and like all these different. It's very psychological in terms of the approach to food and to under eating and under fueling. But yeah, I mean, if someone is like consistently low and their metabolism is just totally crushed and the body is just trying to retain as much tissue as possible, then you might not see tons of body weight change, but they're actively in reds. Long story short.
Thank you. Yeah.
So moving on to our other two macros, right? Protein is going to be most important. Definitely number one macro to think about. We calculate our protein intake, figure out our amount that we need. So we multiply our body weight times 1.4 to 2.2. And from there, we can basically get that baseline for protein. Then we want to make sure that we're getting enough fuel. So weightlifting is going to primarily use the phosphagen energy system. And so we don't want to get fully into energy systems for those who, may not be as familiar with that. Pardon me. But basically our body can either break down carbs or fats, at least for fuel, or at least in terms of a really short-term burst of energy, we can use an energy intermediary called creatine phosphate, where it's this kind of molecule that's stored in our muscle cells, and we can break that apart and use it for energy for muscular contraction. So creatine phosphate, we only have so much of it. We do need other fuel sources. And so the preferential or the preferred fuel source for the body is going to be carbs. Carbs are good. Carbs are not evil, especially in the context of weightlifting. There's interesting evidence to show that if you're in like a carb restricted state, you're really maybe even messing a little bit with like muscle growth and recovery. So we want to consume enough carbs. And so what are these? They're going to be, any sort of grain, obviously fruits, vegetables, legumes. And these are going to be containing, just like protein, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Unlike protein, they do not contain nitrogen though. And so the main kind of point here is going to be energy. We're getting 4 kcals per gram again, just like protein or very similar to protein. We get it from those grains, fruits, and vegetables. And carbohydrate containing foods are also bringing other things along for the ride. And so this just looks like a healthy assortment of food, right? We've got fruits. There's a variety of vitamins and minerals that are going to be present in fruits and vegetables. We see some dark leafy greens. We see okra. We see grains that are going to have fiber. We see some Brussels sprouts, right? So carbohydrate containing foods often bring other things along for the ride that are very, very beneficial for us in terms of health and wellness. And we want to make sure that we're also at least thinking about our health, even though we may really care about weightlifting performance. So getting carbohydrates from those other foods, some of which fill us up and make us feel better and obviously support health, that's also helpful. And so a big kind of fuel source for us for weightlifting is going to be some sort of complex carbohydrate. So carbohydrates, right, these sugars, we link them end to end in this branched format, and we get starch. So starch is the storage form of carbohydrates that's found in plants. We get all kinds of foods, or we have all kinds of foods out there that contain a lot of starch. Breads, they're made from starches, right? So the starch found from wheat, corn, rice, etc., potatoes. So we're seeing a lot of different starches that are going to be great energy sources for us. We can then store that as glycogen. And so muscle or liver glycogen, this is how we're going to store carbohydrates. And in the context of weightlifting, we do actually care about glycogen. This is going to be a very, very complex kind of branched structure where we have all these glucose molecules that are linked together, and our body can access that and break it down and then use that glucose to power muscular contractions or other cellular processes. And so we're going to have some stored in our muscles. We're going to have some stored in our liver. And so just walking around, doing our thing day to day, and let's say we forget to eat one meal, we may tap into a little bit of that liver glycogen. Your liver breaks down some of these molecules and releases blood glucose out into the bloodstream. And so, those of you who are watching this or you're here now, if you've ever been in a situation where you have low blood glucose, it doesn't feel good, right? You feel really gross. You get a headache. You feel super lethargic. It's not going to be good for weightlifting performance. You want to make sure that you are optimizing kind of your energy stores and optimizing kind of your criteria for success, so to speak. So sufficient carbohydrates, that's going to be the name of the game. So what's the point? Well, it's really to fuel us. We want to have enough fuel on tap to be able to do muscular contraction, to be able to sustain weightlifting movements, to, let's say, have that kind of intermittent activity throughout a 2.5 or 3 hour training session where we hit our snatches, we hit our pulls, we do squats, we do accessories, etc. That's our fuel. Yes, our body can burn fat as well, but carbohydrates are going to be really helpful for us. The other thing as well, just from a health perspective, is fiber. Carbohydrate foods are going to contain a lot of fiber. The fiber recommendations in America are really, really, people don't hit them very often. So, we're right in the neighborhood of like 40-ish grams of fiber for males and about 30-ish grams of fiber for females. People are nowhere near that in some cases. So getting whole grains, getting some sort of food, getting fruits, getting a variety of fiber supplements can be helpful. And it can help us with, for instance, cholesterol management. It can help us with regularity. So promoting just moving things through the digestive tract. It can help us with kind of control of energy as well. So if someone's trying to, let's say, cut down a weight class, having a higher fiber diet is going to keep them fuller longer and allow them to stay in a caloric deficit more effectively. And then it's also very, very good for our gut microbiome. So fiber is important. It's maybe not a direct and kind of super clear cut, like, oh yeah, if you eat more fiber, you're going to put 10 kilos on your snatch. But it kind of helps us in terms of maintaining general health. If, for instance, you've been sitting on the toilet straining for 30 minutes in the middle of your training session because you're ultra constipated because you don't eat any fiber, it's not going to be very helpful to weightlifting performance then either. So fiber is crucial. And so for weightlifters, what I would say is kind of figuring out what works best in terms of the amount of carbohydrate intake. On the low end, about 3 grams per kilo is generally what we're seeing. On the high end, it's kind of a little bit more inter-individual. In some cases, it may be kind of 3 to 5, 3 to 6. Some people really like their carbs. And so maybe we're at like 3, on the low end, but like 8-ish on the high end. Above 8, and we're really getting to that like ultra endurance athlete nutrition. So I don't think we need to go much above that though. And a lot of this really is going to be what foods that person likes. What foods sit well? Do people like to eat apples before training? Do we like to have a bunch of brown rice along with some chicken for lunch? Do we want to have, let's say, some candy during training? That's a really common thing within weightlifting and powerlifting, just to kind of give us some kind of energy. And it's also, from a psychological standpoint, it's kind of a nice reward, right? So there's some interesting research looking at like glucose mouth rinsing or like tasting sweet things and how it actually does change performance outcomes. So rinsing with like a glucose solution or eating something sweet before it's even digested, and we haven't changed anything metabolically, we don't have more energy to access yet, but the brain kind of senses that and knows like, oh, wow, I've got some energy coming. And so we can actually see some performance benefits. I need to check in terms of weightlifting, but that is a thing in terms of endurance athletes. So from a reward standpoint, though, if like on your big squat day, you're having some Sour Patch Kids, and that's just like a cool reward and it makes sure your energy levels are topped off, that's a win. On the flip side, though, I would say that overall, focusing on whole foods is going to be the name of the game. So making sure we're getting enough fiber, making sure we're keeping kind of a variety of options in terms of carb intake. So getting our vegetables, making sure that we're not just eating white rice, chicken, and broccoli only, but getting kind of a well balanced variety. So carb intake, the goal is fuel, but there's a lot of other health implications here. And there will be a point in time, whether it's, let's say, maybe for everyone who's watching this or you're doing this now, where you're a master's athlete and, you've been in the game for 25 years. You want to keep weightlifting, you want to stay healthy, starting earlier is going to be better. Or, in the case like me, where I'm like, oh, okay, I'm kind of done with the sport, it's beating me up a little bit, but we switch to other things. And so making sure that we're thinking about our health and wellness kind of moving forward just for life is important. And then kind of to wrap up our macronutrients, we also have fats. Fats are not going to be the name of the game or the priority for us to consume. We need a certain amount of them. So usually we don't want to go much under 20% of our total calories from fats. And it's going to be a really, really concentrated energy source. So as we can see here, 9 kcals per gram. So these are more than double the energy density of our carbs and proteins. All kinds of food sources are going to contain fat. So our nuts, our seeds, our avocados, our fatty fish, our oils. And fat's good. Fat is very, very beneficial for us. It's important for hormone function. It's going to be really, really important for just kind of cell function in general. And so in terms of the actual type or the specific molecule of fat that we're consuming, primarily it's going to be triglycerides. So this is a particular dietary fat. It's made up of a glycerol backbone with 3 of these long chains of carbons and hydrogens attached to them. And depending on how long that chain is, as well as some of its properties, that'll dictate whether it's a saturated fat or an unsaturated fat. And so as you might have heard, saturated fats are not maybe as healthy for us. And we want to kind of limit their consumption. They're associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Unsaturated fats, not as much. So we get saturated fats from different animal products, so butters, meats, etc. Unsaturated we get from oils, nuts, seeds, etc. So making sure that we're keeping kind of a variety of fat and thinking about where it's coming from is kind of what I would say is most important for us. There are other fats that we consume in the diet, so cholesterol, right? This is going to be something that we use it for a variety of functions, for hormone function, cell membrane integrity, etc. And then also phospholipids, which are a component of cell membranes. For us, right, within weightlifting, we really want to think about fat in terms of the rest of the puzzle. So we figured out our total energy intake. Maybe you used an app or you calculated things out using the equations. We then figured out protein intake. That's a certain amount of calories. We then figure out carb intake. That's also a certain amount of calories. And so now we need to figure out kind of the final amount of calories that we have available. And whatever that is left, is going to be fat. Hopefully not less than 20% of our calories. So if it is less than that, we may need to bump it up a little bit and then take some out of protein or carbs. But we're basically thinking about just where are we getting this in our diet? So for instance, if we're getting protein foods or carbohydrate containing foods that also contain fat, well, we don't need to have a discrete fat source. We don't need to be like, oh, okay, well, I had, let's say, a chicken breast with whatever, I don't know, I'm trying to think of, that was sauteed in some oil. And I had a baked potato with it with some sour cream. Well, the potato is going to be a carbohydrate source, but the sour cream and maybe butter you put on it, that is fat. So maybe we don't need to have, like, say, a whole handful of nuts on top of that, because we've already had enough fat from the baked potato and that little bit of oil that was in the chicken. Or maybe instead of chicken, we had a steak. Steak is going to be typically fattier than chicken. And so as a result, we're good on fat just from having that kind of main protein food of steak that also had fat in it. So making sure that we're not overdoing it on fat is probably going to be helpful for us to make sure we're in that proper weight class. And then in terms of the type of fat, focusing on unsaturated fat is going to be probably the best bet for health. Within performance, it's probably not as big of a deal, but at least making sure that we're not only eating saturated fat from animal products, but also having some of that olive oil or having some of those nuts and seeds, just from a health perspective. Once again, we want to be around for a long time to enjoy the sport of weightlifting and other aspects of our lives. All right. So I guess before we jump into the remainder. Any questions or comments about these two macronutrients, fats or carbs?
If you were giving advice to maybe like a younger weightlifter, me and Brian are always, very adamant, to not cut weight at a young age, and
Mm.
those kinds of things. But maybe for somebody that is a little more experienced, medals are on the line, maybe making an international team is on the line kind of thing. What are, the weight cutting strategies that you see out there, and which ones are safer, less safe? And like, is there a specific like protocol maybe you would recommend like from the dietary side of things? In sort of what amounts, you see a lot of people maybe go like a whole day without eating at all, maybe 2 days, doing a lot of exercise. Like, what are kind of your impressions of that side of things?
Oh, sure. Well, I think even just thinking about the nature of weightlifting weigh-ins is important. So some sports that are more, I guess, commercialized in a sense have the full 24-hour weigh-in, which is a totally different ballgame in terms of what people can get away with. So, you hear within certain powerlifting federations or, for instance, mixed martial arts, where, within a 24-hour weigh-in, I mean, they do crazy stuff, ultra dehydration, not eating at all, tons of exercise. And so they can drop, I mean, some of the professional MMA fighters, for instance, or some powerlifters, you're looking at 35, 40 pounds, or, if we're thinking kilos, I mean, it's like more than 10% of their body mass in some cases, which is just crazy. And it's obviously not going to be very, very, what's the word? They're not going to be ready to perform within 2 hours of finishing that. They have a full 24 hours. They can sleep. They can get a ton of food in them. They can get probably some sort of IV rehydration in the case of a really well-funded person, MMA or someone that's got a lot of money to do this stuff. But weightlifting is different, right? So weightlifting, we've got the 2 hour weigh-in. And so I think that really changes the nature of what people should be doing because you've got to get your act together within 2 hours of stepping off that scale, or sometimes a little bit less, depending on kind of just whenever you can get in the room and get on the scale and go. And then you got to warm up pretty soon too. So I would say that you ideally minimizing the water restriction, minimizing any sort of like true food restriction, and like losing the weight legit is probably the way to go. So getting in a true kind of long-term caloric deficit, keeping protein very, very high, and then figuring out where among our other two macronutrients we need to take a little bit from. Probably a little bit from carbohydrates, maybe a little bit from fats, but keeping protein probably in the neighborhood of 1.8 grams per kilo or higher is going to be really, really important for those athletes. Talking briefly about supplements, we'll get into that a little bit more, but like creatine, I wouldn't go off of creatine in the case of a weightlifter who's cutting. I would stay on it. There is some water that comes along for the ride with creatine supplementation, but it's such a beneficial supplement that I don't think it's worth coming off of. But yeah, within kind of those individuals that are trying to drop, doing it right, taking a very, very long time and very, very slowly, and just tracking food, whether it's only protein or tracking every calorie, and just making sure that things are very, very gradual to minimize muscle mass loss and also allow that person to keep training versus a crash diet or a crash, ultra kind of dehydration protocol where they're not going to be ready to perform within that 2 hour period after finishing that. It's just not going to happen. So yeah, caloric deficit, obviously manipulation of hydration can be fine, but just to not drink water or to get in a sauna suit or do some of those crazy stuff or take diuretics, that's just a no-go. And that's how we get all kinds of really sad stories, for instance, within the world of like high school wrestling of different kids that end up, having significant problems because the coach or someone they trusted was having them do, or maybe they were coming up with some really, really extreme protocol when they shouldn't have. So yeah, I would be very, very cautious restricting water beyond kind of a normal, just slightly less amount, and just very, very cautious about any sort of, especially like pharmaceutical intervention like diuretics or like saunas.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So, when you do that sort of long-term decrease, most coaches still would recommend, I think, that maybe you come in just slightly over your weight class even on that morning weight. I guess what I tell my athletes is like half a kilo over, a kilo over on their morning weight. And then you can make some very small tweaks like with their sodium or with their carbohydrate intake the day before.
Right.
Maybe just like a morning fast for like 4 hours until their weigh-in kind of thing. And it's not very disruptive, I guess, to
Yeah.
their performance. But yeah, it's probably only in the neighborhood of, 1 to 2% body weight loss, like, as far as like from a typical morning weight. And I think you're right. Like anything more than that, and you're just decreasing performance. Like it's probably exponential the way performance decreases with that.
I would think so. Yeah, especially weightlifting. I mean, compared to other sports, for instance, like wrestling or MMA, it's like, well, maybe they had a bad day too, right? Like maybe they had a bad weight cut, and the person that you're about to wrestle, you're about to start punching in the face, feels just as bad as you do. And it's skill based, and and it's like whatever. There's stuff that can happen in a fight like that. But gravity never has a bad day, right? So so it's the weight is gonna be the same. And so yeah, knowing that and kind of just making sure that you're preparing yourself as best as possible and not doing something really extreme that just makes it so much more difficult to actually perform when you're out on the platform. So yeah, 100%.
Hobby weightlifters and competitors training might seem the same, but there's one big difference. Competitors need to hit their best lifts on the competition platform. It doesn't matter what you did in training if you can't perform when it counts, and your program should reflect that. Instead of following random programming, maxing out all the time, and hoping for the best on game day, our Competition Strong Team program focuses on long-term progressions that set you up to have your best competition day yet. Each training cycle is carefully designed around the USA Weightlifting National Circuit, so you'll hit your biggest lifts at the Arnold, the American Open Series 2, and of course, the National Championships. If you're ready to take your training to the next level and get platform ready, then click the link in the description below or scan the QR code on the screen for a free week trial today. All right, back to the show.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, great comments, Calvin. Okay, well, I guess we can continue chatting a little bit about kind of hydration just briefly. I think it's a good segue into hydration. Just to kind of generally talk about it here, I don't have a ton of recommendations, but water obviously is super important. We need to be consuming as much water as we can within the context of thirst. So if someone's thirsty all day and they're not drinking a lot of water, or they're not having some sort of liquid that contains water, whether that's Gatorade, milk, coffee, even, etc., that person needs to drink more because it's used for all kinds of different stuff, right? So we're transporting stuff to the body via blood. We're obviously transporting our macros and micros. It's going to be important for just function, protection, temperature regulation. And so really making sure that we're not thirsty is kind of at least what I would say to a younger weightlifter or someone. There's different kind of metrics, but weightlifting is an indoor sport primarily. Yes, if someone's training in a garage gym outside in the summer, then yeah, you got to up your water. Obviously, we're going to care about that context, but competitions are indoors. So like the dehydration side of sports nutrition and like, intra exercise hydration, it's just not as crucial or pivotal, I'd say, but obviously making sure that that person's still drinking water, drinking some sort of beverage, drinking a sports drink, perhaps while training or competing, and making sure that they're drinking slightly before thirst even, that'll be enough. So if you're thirsty, it's already a little too late. Start getting some water in you, obviously within the context of hydration. In competition, it can get kind of tricky because you don't want to be drinking too much water where then you have to start going to the bathroom a bunch either. So kind of timing water intake and making sure that we're at least thinking through even bathroom breaks in the context of hydration is important. So maybe right before warm-ups, bathroom. And then you're ready for that, at least let's say that first lift. We're able to do snatches, get a bathroom break, do clean and jerks, or start warming up for clean and jerks. So timing of bathroom stuff is also important, depending on the venue you're in and where you're at and all that stuff. Is water available? So I think back to when I was competing at the Arnold Classic, for instance, in Columbus. There was a huge line for the water fountain in the middle of my session. And so luckily I was able to get water and then keep going. But if I didn't have water and then all of a sudden I'm really, really thirsty going into my clean and jerks, that's not going to be good either. So kind of planning ahead from a competition standpoint, making sure we have enough water, making sure we're hydrated, that's obviously going to be important. In terms of vitamins and minerals, this one's kind of interesting in that a lot of times there are certain deficiencies that are just common across the US population. So like magnesium is a big one. Vitamin D, often people are a little bit deficient in, et cetera. But we really can just kind of solve that if we're eating a varied diet. So we get a bunch of different fruits, vegetables, grains, et cetera, dark leafy greens, and we take a vitamin supplement of some sort. So you get some sort of, multivitamin, gummy vitamin, whatever it is. Pardon me, you take that, you get some nutritional insurance in the sense where now at least we know that we're consistently getting a variety of vitamins and minerals. And we're probably not going to see really performance impairments as a result of some sort of vitamin deficiency. So of our vitamins, right, water and fat soluble, just making sure that if we do take a multivitamin, you take it with food, because our 4 fat soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, they need a little bit of fat to properly absorb. And then obviously whole food sources as well. So getting a variety of fruits and vegetables, getting a variety of grains, et cetera, that is important as well. In terms of the minerals, right? So these are going to be different elements from our periodic table. So some metals, some non-metals, et cetera. Minerals, same kind of thing. If we take a multivitamin, multi-mineral supplement, we're probably going to be fine. There's, just a variety of different ones. I think I had said magnesium is a common mineral that people are deficient in, and then obviously certain vitamins. So take a supplement. That's probably going to be enough to kind of ensure that people are good for weightlifting. So that brings us kind of to a nice little segue of supplements. So where do supplements fit in with all of this? So in my mind, supplements, especially for performance, are really here at the top of the pyramid. And in the sense of, a food pyramid or a pyramid, that basically means that stuff at the base, right, that's larger, so to speak, it's the foundation of what we're building on. So number one for athletes is going to be eat enough. If we're not eating enough, right, we're not in proper energy balance, everything else is going to be so much harder to pull off. So first, we got to make sure we're eating the proper amount of food. Are we kind of sustaining our functions? Then we can worry about which specific macronutrients we're taking. Are we getting enough protein versus carbs versus fats within that energy balance? Then we can worry about micros. So are we going to be getting enough micronutrients from our different foods, or do we need to supplement? And so maybe we need to have some sort of Flintstones vitamin. And then we can kind of think through when we're eating that food. So I haven't gotten a ton into nutrient timing, but it's not just about what we eat, but when we eat it. And so, for instance, protein shakes. Is there a particular time when it's probably best to, let's say, get protein? If there's one specific time across a training day, I would say it's post-workout, which is common sense. You want to get some protein in you after your training session. That is the most important time for protein. If, let's say, you wait 4 hours by accident, or life happens and you weren't able to get food right after training, that's okay. It's fine. It'll work out. You're not going to lose all your gains, but we want to try to optimize things. And so, closer to training is probably going to be better. After worrying about nutrient timing, then we can start to worry about supplementation. So supplements are definitely a small piece of the puzzle. It's not going to be the mainstay for us. And so what we're going to do briefly is just talk through 2 particularly important supplements that are very, very beneficial, especially for weightlifting. And that's going to be creatine and caffeine. And then we'll just kind of start chatting about any other questions we have. So creatine and caffeine. Creatine, this is going to be a super, super common supplement within the world of weightlifting. And what it does is it basically gives us a greater store of energy within our muscles. And so if you remember kind of what I was talking about at the beginning of our little kind of session here, if we are doing some sort of really high intensity activity, our muscles and other cells in our body can break apart creatine phosphate and use it ultimately to power our cells. And so by taking creatine supplementation, we're basically getting more of that creatine phosphate in our cells, which then means that we're able to do more of that high intensity activity. So this is really, really well studied, very, very common within the world of sport nutrition. Creatine is kind of having a renaissance right now. So it's really breaking out into the mainstream, I would say, which is exciting and it's awesome. So really, really well studied, really, really effective. And what we see here is basically we're just able to do high intensity exercise for longer. So a little bit more powerful, a little bit higher intensity, and also longer. Lower fatigue, we're going to potentially see kind of benefits long-term where if we're taking this across a training program, we may gain more muscle mass because we were able to do, let's say, 10% more every single set. We're able to run a little bit faster every single time we're on the track. So creatine is really, really helpful. It allows us to do more work. We do sometimes retain more water as part of creatine supplementation. And then there is some kind of more recent evidence within like kind of the kind of neuroprotection side, where especially with aging or other kind of issues within the brain, creatine can actually be really helpful because it's an energy source. So the neurons in the brain, they're getting that energy as well. They're able to then access that creatine. Now, in terms of the different types of creatine, there's a ton of different types of creatine out there. Creatine monohydrate, creatine ethyl ester, crealkaline, etc. Creatine monohydrate is probably going to be the best choice. So it's very, very well studied. It's the most studied, and it's also the cheapest. That's the one to go with. I personally think that CreaPure brand of creatine monohydrate is probably going to be the best bet for athletes. This is going to be a creatine product that's made in Germany. It has very, very high quality standards. It's going to be a lot less kind of risk of contamination and adulteration. So, and I have no financial affiliation with CreaPure, just saying that. They did give us free creatine from one study, but it's just the best on the market right now. So CreaPure, creatine monohydrate. And ultimately, how do we take it? Right, we're going to be taking about 3 to 5 grams per day across about a month. And we start to see muscular creatine or intramuscular creatine content creep up and kind of get up to a higher level. And that means then we can do more of that high intensity physical activity for a little bit longer. We can also do a loading protocol where during that first week or kind of several weeks of creatine supplementation, we take 20 grams across multiple doses per day. And that's going to increase the creatine content in the muscle much more rapidly than just taking 5 grams and seeing that slow increase. And so probably closer to working out is when to take it. Creatine timing, there's still a lot of kind of debate over that. We did a study on creatine timing last year. Still need to kind of finish working through the data on that. So stay tuned. But we did it in the weightlifting team at Lindenwood. So hopefully we can get some interesting findings out related to creatine timing. So when to take it? Probably closer to working out. We're not 100% sure yet. How much? About 5 grams per day, and just keep taking it. What type? Creatine monohydrate. Ideally, CreaPure is probably going to be the best bet. So that brings us to caffeine. So caffeine, another super, super beneficial and very, very well-researched sports supplement. Really, creatine and caffeine, as well as protein powder, but that's really more almost like a food product. Those are going to be the 2 most effective supplements within weightlifting. And what caffeine does is it's going to basically inhibit a molecule called adenosine. And so adenosine, this is a neuromodulator that builds up in our central nervous system as we get tired. And so we basically see more and more and more adenosine getting released, and we have receptors for it that basically sense when we have more of it, and it tells us, oh, I'm getting tired. Caffeine is going to bind to that receptor instead of adenosine, and it blocks the effect, which means that we have increased alertness. And ultimately, we can see changes to metabolism. We see changes to strength and power. So power output goes up, sprinting goes up, strength performance can go up, muscular endurance can go up. We have less fatigue during exercise. So if you're doing a bunch of reps, caffeine may kind of allow us to do a few more reps. We see that things feel easier when we take caffeine. So it's kind of like a superpower. Obviously, though, we're going to see that caffeine also changes some cardiovascular parameters. So we see, an increase in blood pressure, heart rate, potential arrhythmias as well. So we got to kind of watch out. We don't want to go too crazy with our caffeine. Generally within kind of strength and power. So for weightlifting, we're really seeing like a dose of about 4 to 6 grams per, milligrams, not grams, milligrams per kilo. And so that's depending on someone's body weight, in the neighborhood of like 250 to like 450 milligrams of caffeine. So between 2 and like 5 cups of coffee or a couple energy drinks. So it is a lot of caffeine. And generally, at least variety of different safety organizations or professional organizations suggest that we don't go much above 500 milligrams. So keeping our caffeine content and being strategic with it is going to be important. If, for instance, we're training, we want to optimize our performance, taking caffeine is going to help with that, but making sure that we're doing it in a smart way. Now, we'll get into that in a second, a little bit more about caffeine timing. People will, in some cases, cycle on or off of caffeine. That can be helpful, but you probably don't have to do it. So keep that in mind, right? You can just keep drinking your coffee, keep taking your energy drinks. It will still help you. If you really want to optimize things, you can at least play around with going off of caffeine for a little bit and then coming back on. But I don't think that that's necessary. So caffeine, I'd say, is probably the poster child for nutrient timing in terms of making sure that we do it right. Because as we've all known, or as we've, let's say, hadn't happened to us, when you drink coffee or you drink an energy drink, it's going to hit you after a certain period of time. And it depends a little bit on what you ate along with it and the type of caffeine you consumed. And so here we see Vin Diesel on the right, and he had his pre-workout and he's driving to the gym and it kicks in a little too early. That's obviously not going to be ideal for performance. So caffeine timing is also going to be a really important kind of consideration for us. I've done some research within caffeine timing. So this is my master's thesis back in the day. And really there's a couple of schools of thought. One is to try to kind of coincide starting exercise with increasing caffeine concentration. So this figure is showing us time on the x-axis and then caffeine concentrations in the bloodstream on the y-axis, and then a variety of different kind of modes of caffeine administration. And so right during that kind of first 30 minutes-ish after we ingest caffeine, we're seeing a big peak in the bloodstream, and then it levels off as the liver metabolizes it. And so a couple options. One is to do basically start exercise while we're seeing an increase in caffeine. It's still being absorbed. It's still peaking in our bloodstream. And that's when we start. Or we start exercise right at the peak. So right as caffeine's hitting its peak, and then it's starting to go down. Based on my research, so the study I did, it was in males and females. We did lower body kind of strength parameters. It seems that 1 hour pre-exercise or pre-performance time is probably going to be best. And so when I say pre-performance time, that means basically at the point at which you need optimal performance. So if, for instance, you're thinking ahead, you're like, okay, I probably am going to be on the platform at X time. And if I work backwards, I'll start warming up now. Okay, I want to have peak caffeine concentration during my snatches, maybe during my opening attempt on snatch, whatever it is. Work backwards about an hour prior to that is when you should be taking it. Or, okay, you know what? I want kind of right before clean and jerks. Then that's probably when you need to be taking that. So thinking about 1 hour pre-exercise or pre kind of peak performance time, that's your goal. Same thing, for instance, with training sessions. So we've all been there. We've done our multiple hour training sessions. Maybe you've had 2.5 hours and you did a bunch of snatches or clean and jerks, and now you got to do a bunch of back squats, and it's super tough squat day. And that's what you're really focused on. That's what you time your caffeine off of. So maybe you don't even take your caffeine until after you finish part of your workout, and you take it an hour prior-ish to that next big thing. Maybe it's those squats, maybe it's pulls, whatever it is. And generally with liquid caffeine, we're going to see peaks occurring between 45 minutes to an hour. There is a little bit of inter-individual variability and variety, but usually around there is where we see that kind of that peak occur. So caffeine timing absolutely matters. Timing it properly, figuring out what works for you, and then making sure that the amount of caffeine is not too high, because obviously that can affect kind of our concentration and stuff like that, is also going to be helpful for us. So with that, that's kind of all I wanted to present, super quick little overview of basic sport nutrition concepts, for someone that really hasn't had exposure to that yet. A little bit of talk about supplements. But with that, yeah, just love to chat more if there's any other questions y'all have. And thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, Brian, did you have anything?
Let's see. I did have a question about cutting. I've heard people say that, especially with younger lifters, with youth lifters in particular, cutting weight repeatedly it can be like bad for hormones for youth lifters. Is that true?
Interesting. I'm not as familiar, I guess, with that area of the literature, but I guess it depends on how much, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like if it's just a little bit of a kind of quick blip in terms of their growth, like especially if someone's, very young and still growing, it's probably not ideal, especially if they're already at kind of a healthy body weight, versus someone, let's say, is clearly overweight or in, experiencing childhood obesity. That's maybe a different story because the benefits, obviously, of losing some body fat probably outweigh any potential hormonal or long-term issues. But yeah, making sure that we're not going crazy with it, especially the really young lifters, I think is important. So just kind of letting nature take its course, and as we get into those preteen years, we hit puberty. That's maybe when we can start to see a little bit more kind of finger on the scale, so to speak, in terms of a coach being like, well, hey, I think we really should try to optimize you for X, Y, or Z weight class within reason.
Hmm. That makes sense. Yeah, I've heard this, especially it's kind of common here in Florida weightlifting. It's a high school sport here.
Right.
Um, and they've got weight classes, and you'll see a lot of the time like high school kids are trying to cut weight to get down 2 weight classes because the 2 kids in their school in their weight class are way more competitive. So now they got to drop a good amount of weight. Like I can't imagine that that's going to be great for you, especially not. I mean, on a performance aspect, it's certainly not going to be great for you. You're more than likely just going to feel weak and tired. Um, but then I worry that there might be some developmental issues too that happen if you're cutting big weight classes like that as a teenager, where really this is the time that you should be building a lot of muscle and growing the most.
100%. No, I totally agree. I think, yeah, I mean, and not to mention like the psychological or kind of sociological aspect of like an adversarial relationship with food at that young of an
Mhm.
age. Like it introduces all kinds of issues. I think that, yeah, avoiding and making sure that at least is not coming down from a coach, I think is really important. So yeah, if and yeah, there's always going to be knuckleheads, that are like, oh, I really want to do X, Y, or Z, and it's like, okay, here's why you probably shouldn't. And yeah, if they're short sighted and they really want to compete because so and so is better than them and is at that one weight class and they need to go under, it's like, yeah, obviously it's tough to talk with a kid in that situation or a young person in that situation who is so dialed in and so kind of thinking in the short term.
Absolutely. Um, I think that was the only question that I had that popped up for me.
I had a few little ones. First, I wanted to. Emily texted me. She had to hop off the call to go somewhere. But she wanted to know. So she calculated out her protein based on the guidelines you gave. I think she's about 65 kilos, and she said, I figured out I need 90 per day. And she was like, but is that just to maintain, or do I need more if I'm trying to build muscle? So that was her question.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, and I guess that would be 1.4 grams per kilo roughly. So yeah, I'd probably say, or maybe that was 1.6. I mean, if we were to calculate, let me pull up my phone calculator here. For her specific instance, right, 65 kilos.
So she might even need more than that, really.
Yeah, because I mean, so like 65, so she may have been doing 1.4 because that's let's see, is 91. So that's the bare minimum for a strength and power athlete or really any type of athlete. But yeah, I mean, looking at like 1.6, which is a little bit better. I mean, we're seeing 105, probably 1.8 might even be better than that, which is 117 or 120. So yeah, I mean, making sure that we're getting high quality protein spread across the day is really important. Definitely for weight gain, but particularly for weight loss. If someone's in a caloric deficit, like that's the time that you have to have protein dialed in. But yeah, I mean, I would say in the case of Emily, I mean, yeah, minimum 90. That's like the worst possible day. You were crazy busy and you had to run all over the place and like you missed a meal or something. Like 90 is like the lowest point. Ideally, you're probably closer to like 110, 120, which, that's one more meal. So it's really not that big of a deal. That's like an extra protein shake or another protein bar or some chicken or whatever it is. But probably a little bit more than the 90 would be best. And
And
yeah,
then
gaining weight, it
James
does
has
help.
his hand raised, so
Yeah, please,
see what
James.
James has.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm driving right now, but so that's why I'm just like listening and stuff. But are you guys done answering Emily's question with the protein?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so this lecture is being recorded. I'm assuming it's going to be posted for some more people to listen to. But another question that I think would be good for you to answer would be talking about like pre-workout meals versus intra-workout carbs versus post-workout meals. Because a lot of people like fruit snacks, gummies, Gatorades, stuff like that during training. But obviously, for every meal, you can't be eating a bowl full of fruit snacks or something. So I was wondering if you wanted to talk about like what a good pre-workout meal would be versus like a post-workout meal, and maybe like some intra-workout feeling. Like I think you talked about like the mouth rinsing and stuff. But I was just wondering if you could touch on that, like maybe chicken and rice before, and like maybe percent ranges.
Sure. No, I think that's a great point, James. Yeah, I mean, so honestly, figuring out what works best for individuals and what is sustainable is always going to be the most important, in my opinion. So, if for instance, the ideal pre-workout meal is a full sit down, like you said, chicken and rice, and you get a full array of protein and you have brown rice. So you get kind of some complex carbohydrates, and it's between 2 and 4 hours pre-training. Great. That's awesome. But let's say that you're in classes the whole time before, or you're working before and you can't. Well, maybe then we switch that to a couple RX bars, or we have to, eat some sort of sandwich, figuring out kind of what fits that person's lifestyle and their schedule is obviously going to be really kind of important versus just a one size fits all. But yeah, within that kind of pre-exercise meal, probably shooting for some sort of protein, high quality protein in the neighborhood of about 25 to 40 grams is probably going to be important. Some sort of carbohydrate, probably a complex carbohydrate, so meaning some sort of starch, probably something that is a whole grain or has some fiber, because that's also going to allow us to kind of have a more steady release of glucose across the training session as it gets absorbed and digested. So maybe it's a potato, maybe it's some whole wheat bread and a sandwich, maybe it's brown rice or white rice, which can work fine. Maybe it's a sweet potato, etc. And we have that probably a little bit lower in terms of, any other food that's kind of unusual or unaccustomed. We focus on something that we know works. That would be pre-workout. Intra-workout, you don't have to take intra-workout nutrition. That's really going to be something that I think is most important within an endurance athlete context, where someone maybe has a very long training run and they need some Gatorade. They need some sort of external glucose source, where instead of burning through the glucose that we stored in our muscles or in our liver, instead we can just ingest, digest, absorb some of that glucose, and then it shows up in our bloodstream, and now we can use it for our muscular contractions. But obviously, it can also be useful if we have some calories available and it's a nice treat and we enjoy that. Then yes, Sour Patch Kids, gummy bears, fruit snacks, etc. Theoretically, it's making sure that we're topping off our glycogen throughout our training, kind of during those bouts of exercise that are, in some ways maybe draining it. Weightlifting is probably not going to be super glycogen depleting, but nonetheless, I think that can be helpful for us. So kind of the intra exercise. And then post workout, focusing on protein, that's obviously going to be really, really important there. So whether it's a whey protein shake, maybe it's some sort of whole protein source like chicken, etc., probably focusing a little bit more on a faster digesting carb. So whether that's like a white rice or, some sort of kind of more processed carbohydrate like white bread, white potato, etc., just to kind of get a little bit more glucose into the bloodstream faster for glycogen resynthesis, that will be helpful for us, especially if we have another training session coming up the next day. So definitely prioritizing protein and carbs. Fats are going to kind of come along for the ride. We do not want a super high fat meal, especially pre-exercise. That's going to be really, really bad, especially if we're not used to that. Or if you just, let's say, have a bunch of fried food, or you have a huge greasy pot roast or something, like that's just not going to help us. It's going to sit heavy. It's not going to promote absorption of all those nutrients. Fat slows down gastric emptying. So we definitely want to keep things a little bit lower fat. Don't have to do no fat, but lower fat, where we're not having a super ultra fatty meal or eating, let's say, a bunch of guacamole and chips right before trying to do a bunch of snatches. So kind of common sense, but yeah, avoiding too much fat is also going to be important there. So yeah, I think, whole foods, whatever fits someone's schedule, definitely optimized based on protein and carbohydrate content, especially kind of fast digesting carbs and protein post-workout, and ideally kind of within, I'd say, kind of that first hour post-workout is probably best bet. There's kind of no really downside to eating sooner after training. And there's maybe a little upside in that it's getting those nutrients to us faster. So if there's no downside and a little bit of an upside, then I say do it. So yeah, great question, James.
One question that I had, more so is kind of about a trend that I'm seeing become more popular when
Sure.
it comes to nutrition on social media, is the topic of gut health. And it mostly seems like a way for people to shill gut powders and stuff like that. But, I'm kind of curious about this. Is there anything that athletes should be considering with their nutrition when it comes to gut health for performance or just for long-term health? Or is this something that is mostly just something that we don't really need to worry about?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. So really, there's not as much consistent or super long-term stuff here yet. It's a really, really promising emerging field, though, in terms of kind of the link between performance and health and immune function. And there's so much that we haven't learned yet about the gut microbiome and just what it does for us. So from a practical standpoint, we can optimize gut health without ever needing to take a special probiotic supplement that someone is, like you said, shilling online. 100% that we can do it without that. Probiotics in some cases can be really beneficial. There's tons of different varieties, and each individual strain and kind of specific brand is going to have a variety, different varieties and different proportions and different strains of probiotics. So you can't really paint or talk with a broad brush, so to speak, about them. Generally, if we're eating a lot of fiber, which is going to be essentially a food that those gut bacteria in our large intestines can eat, that's a really good thing. So optimizing our fiber intake, getting a variety of different fiber sources, both soluble as well as insoluble. Soluble just means that it dissolves in water. So you get that from like certain grains like oats, fruits, etc. Insoluble, which is going to be more like that bulk fiber. So, like different vegetables, etc. But getting a lot of different types of fiber, that is going to be really, really beneficial for the gut microbiome. So, whether that's a fiber supplement, whether that's just really making sure that we're getting a variety of different grains that have whole grains or some sort of fiber component, or you're taking some potato or like sweet potato or, high fiber cereal in the morning, like that stuff is going to be really, really helpful in terms of long-term just health and wellness. And yeah, making sure that the gut microbiome is happy. Minimizing antibiotic use. So obviously if someone is, got some sort of antibiotic prescription, really making sure that, if we follow doctor's orders, etc. But then after that antibiotic or after that happens, we got to really make sure we're prioritizing kind of repopulating the gut, so to speak, because the antibiotics are going to kill out a ton of those gut bacteria. How do we do that without supplements? There's a variety of fermented and cultured foods that we can rely on or go to. Yogurt, right? That's going to be a huge one. So a variety of kind of, bacteria in there, lactic acid bacteria that ferment the yogurt. We see other fermented foods like kimchi, et cetera, that also are going to contain live cultures. So I think, yeah, we can definitely get a variety of probiotics from stuff like yogurt, kimchi, kefir. There's a variety of fermented milk products that are very beneficial for us, that are not supplements, and they're not coming with a large price tag. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot more that needs to be learned about probiotics. But I would say, yeah, fiber. And then if we're tolerating them, if we, enjoy sauerkraut or, kimchi or some of these fermented foods or yogurt, then those are really beneficial.
Awesome.
So,
Thank
it's
you.
kind of a varied diet, definitely more on the health side, but yeah, especially from the fiber intake, we want to make sure we're regular. We don't want to be sitting on the toilet a bunch. And obviously, if someone's dealing with like hemorrhoids from having terrible fiber intake and, it's super just, we don't need to get too graphic, but that's not going to be very nice to deal with. And it's not going to be like an enjoyable thing life-wise. And then, if we're sitting on the toilet a bunch when we're supposed to be training, it's not going to help training either.
We got a raised hand from Alex. You go ahead and ask your question if you're ready.
Yeah, I just had a question on the effects of creatine on like the kidney or and that kind of thing. If taking too much of it would negatively affect the kidney or over too long of time without having like an off week or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alex. So yeah, creatine and kidney health, I think is definitely kind of one of those hot button topics where a lot of times people that aren't as familiar with the creatine literature are a little bit, more concerned about, which I think is valid. But yeah, generally, if we're consuming creatine, right, the body of evidence across the last 25, 30 years has shown that it's fine. So it's not going to be detrimental to kidney function if we are already healthy. If someone has kidney disease, should they be taking creatine? Probably not, because it is going to be kind of an additional step or amount that needs to be filtered, with kidneys. Generally when someone's taking creatine, they will have higher creatinine levels. So creatinine is going to be a byproduct of protein breakdown. It is found on our kidney panels. So if someone's doing a kidney test, or like the doctors, pull a panel and they see like, oh, your creatinine is really high, it's because of creatine. It's not directly like a pathological thing. It's just that we're going to have higher levels because we have more creatine now in the bloodstream and ultimately in our muscles. So yeah, I mean, the body of evidence has shown or suggests that we're really not going to see problems in someone who's already healthy from creatine intake in terms of kidney function.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, great question, Alex.
I had a kind of quick rapid fire one as well.
Sure.
So as far as caffeine and sleep, do you have like a quick recommendation about, I don't know, maybe like the half-life of it or that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question, Calvin. I think I maybe meant to address that. I remember setting up kind of a comment about that, and then I don't think I ever got there. So caffeine is going to peak in the bloodstream at about an hour-ish post-ingestion, but then it takes a while to get back down to baseline. And so depending on that individual, it could be anywhere from like 4 hours just to get halfway cleared back down to no levels of caffeine, or up to like 10 to 15 hours. So like pregnancy can change that. Certain drugs can change that, like prescription medication to clarify. So we do want to be careful with caffeine. If you got to train late at night and all of a sudden, we really want to use caffeine for a certain day or a certain training session, yes, it can be helpful for performance, but then it's going to really mess with sleep. So probably shooting for like 6 to 8 hours pre-bedtime as the last time you take caffeine. That's probably going to be the best bet or a best practice, just because even if you do fall asleep after having caffeine close to bed, sleep quality is going to be impacted. So it changes how deeply people sleep. It changes how kind of restful the sleep is and how much quality they have, so to speak. So yeah, avoiding too close of caffeine. And I've been guilty of that. So back in the day, when I was training on the team, I remember, having to hit caffeine super hard at like 5 p.m. because I was going to be training around that. And so I'm taking caffeine at like 4:30, and I just knew I'd be up super late because of it. But it is what it is. It was a trade-off. And so if an athlete is willing to take that trade-off for a particular day where they just know they really need to have that caffeine to help them with a PR or a heavy session, it is a trade-off. But yeah, ideally probably like 4 to 8 hours pre bedtime, but closer to 6 to 8 is the bare minimum to ensure that we're not seeing a ton of sleep disturbance from caffeine.
Something,
Please, yeah, go ahead, Calvin.
something cool I noticed in reference to that graph that was from your master's thesis about caffeine timing was that some of the sources would, hit a lot quicker. So I guess potentially like that could even, like let's say, you use a caffeine gum instead of, like it looks like the capsule like takes a little longer to hit.
Right.
Like that could be even, I can't tell, with the scale at the bottom there, but that might even be 30 minutes, 40 minutes like after, right?
It absolutely is. Yeah, that's a great question. So this particular study, this one was looking at gum versus like kind of I believe it was a gel cap. I would need to look. If not, it was a like a pressed powder cap, if that's kind of ringing a bell.
Yeah.
And yeah, gum is really fast. Like we'll see caffeine concentrations peak or increase in like 10 minutes because it's being absorbed to the oral mucosa versus capsules where it's going to be absorbed through the stomach. And so, you're looking at closer to like an hour or more. Liquid caffeine, so coming from like coffee or a pre-workout or energy drink or soda or whatever, like that's also kind of in that hour range. But yeah, there are faster caffeine sources. So if it's like, I forgot caffeine, or it's like, yeah, caffeine gum could be helpful. The clearance rate is pretty much the same, depending, like the source. Like once it's in the bloodstream, your liver is going to clear it. And so some people clear it faster than others. That's another part of it. So some people are really fast metabolizers where they break it down into its subcomponents and its metabolites faster. Those metabolites themselves also have similar effects to caffeine. So it's not like once it gets cleared and converted to its metabolites that it just goes away. Those three metabolites also are similar to caffeine in their effects. So it takes some time. Like all that is to say, caffeine in the morning or afternoon is probably as late as you should go. If you go later, it's definitely a trade-off with sleep, like you said, which is common sense.
And then Braden has his hand raised. So go ahead, Braden.
What do you think about nicotine use being used for training?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. I guess what perceived benefits do you see within nicotine use? Because I'm not as familiar, I guess, with that area.
I guess like when I use nicotine, I feel something different in my training. I've seen like a couple studies about benefits of it, kind of the same, almost like caffeine, but um different. And also if you're like addicted to it, it's not gonna work the same as if you're like using it at a moderate amount, right? Whether it's nicotine gum, a pouch, something that's just nicotine concentrated.
Yeah, I think that all tracks really well. I mean, yeah, nicotine's an interesting one in that, like, at the receptor level, from my what I'm aware of, like, yeah, there's some like stimulatory effects, but then also some like kind of calming effects, right? So it's this weird kind of middle ground or midpoint where you get certain things going on that are different than like just a pure stimulant like caffeine. I mean, yeah, from my perspective, nicotine, when done carefully, I mean, I believe nicotine itself is a carcinogen, so just keep that in mind. Obviously, taking a nicotine gum or a nicotine patch is obviously going to be the safest versus, maybe the oral pouches, which I know do increase mouth cancer, I believe, and obviously smoking or chewing tobacco are, even higher. Um, so yeah, I mean, kind of within that domain, if it in fact for you or for whoever's using nicotine, if you feel like that's really a benefit, then I think yeah, keep that in mind. But I'd be hesitant to like go recommend that blanket, you know what I mean, to recommend that to just like a beginning weightlifter, like, oh hey, you really should be starting to take some snooze or some nicotine packs. Like you just don't want to, I don't know, set someone on that road unless they really want to go down there, so to speak. If that kind of answers your question, Braden.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a really good point, though. I mean, there's a ton of interesting nicotine research, like especially in the smoking cessation area, I'm sure. But yeah, I would need to look a little closer to see the specific performance effects.
All right. So I think unless anybody else has some other questions to throw out there, I think we're probably going to get wrapping up then, yeah?
Okay, that sounds good. Yeah, well, I
Awesome.
appreciate you all having me. Thanks a bunch. And if anyone does have specific questions for me, I'm always happy to answer some emails. So if you just look up my name, so Patrick Harty, you'll see my email. You'll just say Patrick Harty Lindenwood, click on the Lindenwood address. You'll find my email there. My email is just pharty@lindenwood.edu. But I'm always happy to kind of chat more via email if anything else comes up. And otherwise, yeah, enjoy some great weightlifting with great coaches.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Oh, of course.
If you found this video helpful, then make sure to check out this video here or this episode of the Last Set, Best Set podcast.